I'm your host Michael, and welcome to This Strange Void. Hello strangers, and welcome to episode 6. Thank you for tuning in to another episode dedicated to the strange and wonderful. We are halfway through the spooky month and drawing closer to Halloween, so I guess I should get a couple of spooky episodes done for this month. For the first episode, we'll be covering a topic that has been bastardized by modern adaptations of the creatures. So many cultures around the world share similar views on mythological creatures, from the yokai in Japan, the Devils from South Dakota, and the Fae folk in Ireland. This episode will be focusing on the latter. When we think of fairies, we have small beings in mind, most likely representing tinkerbell. Quite like most things that America has taken from other cultures, they seem to only pick and choose from the best of the bunch and round it off on the edges to be able to fit the positive representation that we commonly think of. Myths and stories about the creatures don't have a single origin, but rather come from a collection of various sources. Various folk theories about the origins of fairies included angels or demons in a Christian tradition, as deities in pagan belief systems, as spirits of the dead, prehistoric precursors to humans, or simply nature spirits. A recurring theme with the legends is the need to ward the fairies off by using protective charms, such as the use of church bells, wearing your clothes inside out to confuse them and not let them lead you astray, four-leaf clovers, and the offering of food. Fairies were also thought to haunt specific locations and lead travelers astray using will-o'-the-wisps. Before the invention of modern medicine, fairies were often given blame for sickness, particularly tuberculosis and birth deformities. Let's get started with the stories, shall we? My trouble with fairies. Growing up, whenever my brother would get hurt, I'd blame it on my fairy friends. My parents never believed me though, and I'd always get punished. It didn't help that my brother said I was the one who pushed him or punched him or scratched him. No matter how much I protested, at the end of it all, I was the one who got in trouble. So at a young age, I learned that I was the only one that could see the fairies. For some time, it was a mixed blessing. Having friends that only I could see meant there wasn't anyone that could tell them to leave me alone or that they had to go home because I needed to go to bed. It was nice to never feel lonely. The issue, unfortunately, was that the fairies were mischievous. They'd rarely listen when I told them to stop what they were doing. They would just laugh and flit about and continue with their fun. Most of the time it was harmless, albeit obnoxious. They'd flutter their little wings under someone's nose and make them sneeze, or they'd knock someone's elbow against a glass and spill their drink all over the table. That kind of thing. On occasion, however, their activities were more serious, especially when it came to my older brother. The fairies didn't like how Todd would talk to me. I didn't think much of it. I was the younger sister and he was the bratty teenage brother. I just thought that's how the world worked. The fairies begged to differ, and they wanted to make it known. That's when they'd scratch and hit him. It went on for years as his treatment of me got worse and worse. On a Saturday morning when I was in bed being lazy and listening to the rain fall outside, I heard a muffled scream from Todd's room on the other side of the wall. The scream was followed by retching and gagging, and Todd streaked past my doorway and into the bathroom where he vomited loudly, and often my parents noticed the commotion and came to his aid. Mum's shout was loud enough to cut through the sound of Todd's puking, and Dad swore. That scared me. He never did that. I stood in the doorway while the fairies giggled and floated in an orbit around my head. I knew whatever they'd done to my brother had to be worse than the things that they'd done in the past. My father stormed from the bathroom and entered Todd's room. He came back a second later with a fistful of something. He stood in front of me, eyes glazed with rage and disgust. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he hissed, and opened his hand. I shrieked with surprise and disgust when I saw what he held. It was the body of a small bird, a sparrow maybe, that was cut up and bleeding. Dislodged feathers stuck to the blood and greasy white discharge oozing from its truncated rear half. "Do you have any idea how sick your brother can get from this?" Dad asked. Behind his rage was a tone of deep concern and even fear. His fear only amplified my own. I didn't, I stammered, and my eyes darted back and forth as I followed the hysterically laughing fairies as they swept back and forth across the carnage in my father's palm. "Stay here," Dad ordered. But I tried to interject, but he grabbed my shoulder hard with his free hand and held me against the doorframe. The din of giggles stopped. I heard them whispering amongst themselves. Dad leaned down and pushed his forehead against mine. When he spoke, his words were clear and smelled like the coffee he'd been drinking. "You are not to say another word. You are not to leave this room. I am taking your brother to the doctor, and if your mother tells me you've said anything or set foot outside, I promise you will regret it." He squeezed my shoulder harder and I winced and tried to fight back the tears. He stared at me for a full 10 seconds without saying anything, and then he let me go. Dad turned the corner to head downstairs, and I saw what was coming, but was too afraid to speak up. As he started down, I saw the fairies hurl themselves against the bottom of his foot before it made contact with the first step. His foot landed awkwardly and his ankle twisted, sending him face first into an uncarpeted wooden steps. The sound of his face impacting with the stairs seemed louder than anything I'd ever heard. Mum called from the bathroom, where she was still attending to Todd. Dad didn't answer. I peeked around the corner. He was on his belly at the bottom of the stairs. He was moaning and weakly flailing his arms against the hard wood. His legs were still on the steps, but they didn't move at all. Mum came out and down the hall, glaring at me before turning the corner and seeing her husband. She gasped and rushed to his aid. Not wanting to make them any angrier than they already were, I turned back into my room. I winced when I put pressure on my right ankle and limped back to bed, where I sat and stared at the fairies. They were laughing again. They flew around like a shimmering animated constellation around the room, weaving in and out of closets and drawers and gumboots. My ankle throbbed. The fairies formed a line in the air and held the formation for a moment, then made a beeline for the dusty corner behind my dresser. They burst into pearls of uproarious laughter and blinked out of view. As the faint sound of sirens in the distance entered my ears, I gingerly walked to where the fairies had gone. I noticed a tiny feather, and then another, and when I reached the dresser and peered behind it, there was a clump of feathers and some blood right next to a small knife from our kitchen. I felt a pang of confused, disconnected recognition, but was shocked back to my senses by a fresh wave of pain from my foot and ankle. I sat on the floor with my back against the dresser. I pulled up the leg of my pajama pants and examined my ankle. It was swollen and red. The top of my foot hurt too, and I drew my knee to my chest so I could get a closer look. Again, I felt confused and out of place. The sirens were loud and close, but I wasn't paying attention to them anymore. I looked around for my fairy friends, but they were nowhere to be seen. For the first time, when I desperately needed to ask them a question, they were gone. My confusion grew teeth and fear pricked the skin off my back and neck. My ankle hurt, but that wasn't what was scaring me. It was my foot. Because even though I watched the fairies trip my dad, for some reason, the imprint of his work boot was etched in the skin of my foot, and my heel was stippled with tiny handprints.
If you're enjoying the podcast, you stranger can help me out. I have a Patreon up and running which directly helps me out. You'll gain access to the private Discord channel where I'll be posting strange and wonderful things, and also chatting about possible topics for future episodes. There is also some cool Strange Void merch for higher tiers, so that's also a bonus. You'll be helping me out for less than a cup of coffee. You can find me over at patreon.com/thisstrangevoid. If you can't help out in that way, you can always help out for free by leaving a rating and review anywhere you may be listening. It goes a long way to help, and you can also follow the podcast on Spotify, which will notify you when a new episode has gone live right as it happens. I'm also on Instagram where I post funny memes and other spooky stuff that I find. You can find me at thisstrangevoid.
In through the fairy door. When our cat Murphy died, my daughter Rebecca was inconsolable. She wanted a replacement, but I wanted a fancy set of leather couches I'd been ogling for years, without the risk of them being torn to shreds by an unruly set of claws. I needed to find a way of distracting Rebecca without resorting to buying a Murphy 2.0. It was while watching a home renovation show one afternoon that I came up with the perfect solution: remodeling her room. "Becca, honey, why don't we give your room a makeover?" The instant smile that appeared on her face told me I'd done the right thing. "Yes!" she squealed, throwing her arms in the air. I'd let her choose the theme and the colours as long as the end result made her happy. It didn't matter even if it looked ridiculous and lowered my property value. Rooms could always be repainted. Rebecca, having the foresight and attention span of any 8-year-old, picked the flavour of the month: fairies. She'd been watching the same blonde-haired, green dress wearing fairy movie for weeks, sometimes twice in one day. I knew the lyrics and dialogue by heart at this point, but I digress. The point is, she wanted her room to become a fairy paradise, and I obliged. I spent the next few weeks remodeling the bedroom. I painted the ceiling and the top half of her walls blue, the bottom half green, and asked a family friend to paint trees, flowers, rocks, and bushes. Whatever it took to make it look like a forest. A few fairy and sparkly decals later, and it became the enchanted forest. I took Rebecca to a used furniture store and let her pick out a few pieces, then repainted them pink. The transformation was almost complete, but once I got her a much needed new bedspread, but something was missing. The room needed one last wow factor, I thought. That weekend I went to a craft show and found exactly what I needed. At the back of a woodworker's booth, hidden behind the set of coat racks and umbrella holders, was an ornate wooden door that measured about 6 inches tall by 3 inches wide. It had adorable little hinges and a beautiful Celtic knot decorating its surface. "What's that?" I asked the older woman sitting behind the desk. She turned to me and smiled. "That's a fairy door, love," she said with an Irish accent. "You put it in your garden or nail it to a tree to invite the fae folk. They'll take care of your plants and bring life and beauty to them." I took the object excitedly. The fairy door was exactly what was missing from Rebecca's room. The wow factor that I'd been looking for. Maybe I'd sneak in one night while she slept and stuff one of her pixie dolls behind it so she'd think it was magic. "It's perfect for my daughter's room," I said. The woman made a few tutting sounds with her tongue and shook her head. "Oh no, love. You wouldn't want to do that." "Why not?" she replied. "Fae folk are fickle little things. They like playing tricks, but they don't like tricks being played on them. If you invite a fairy into our world, it's best not to anger it. They need to be outdoors with the flowers." I laughed. "Duly noted. How much?" She opened a red duotang on the desk and flipped through the pages until she found a picture of the fairy door. Her finger traced along the list of specs until she found the price. $30. But if you buy anything else, I'll give you a discount. $30 seemed a little steep, but it was a nice handcrafted piece of art. One that I knew my daughter would enjoy. A piece that would really complete the look, so to speak. "Sold," I said. I pulled out my wallet and shelled out the money. She took the fairy door, enveloped it, secured it with a few layers of wrapping paper, dropped it in a bag and handed it to me. "Enjoy," she replied. As soon as I got home, I grabbed the toolbox and made a beeline for my daughter's bedroom. After trying out a few spots, I finally settled on nailing the door to the bottom of one of the larger painted trees. Perfect, I thought as I looked at the finished result. Rebecca's room was a masterpiece. Rebecca was elated when she finally saw what had become of her room. She'd been sleeping on the sofa in the basement for a while I'd been working on making her dream a reality. The excitement of it all kept her up particularly late that night, but when she finally went to bed, she was completely tuckered out. Everything was normal for a few days, and Murphy became a thing of the past. One morning, as she was eating her cereal, Rebecca smiled broadly and said, "I saw a fairy last night." I snorted. "Oh, did you?" "Yeah, she's not very pretty," she answered. "That's not nice to say, Becca." "It's true." I turned away, rolled my eyes, and poured myself a cup of coffee. "Everyone is beautiful in their own way," I said. "I think she's hungry," replied Becca. "Well, we should feed her then." Rebecca jumped off her seat. "Okay." "Whoa there, kid. Finish your breakfast first. Your fairy friend can wait," I said, pointing to her bowl. She wolfed down her meal and threw her arms up. "Done." she said victoriously. I put my cup of coffee down and shrugged. I had to think of what to feed her imaginary fairy friend. The last thing I wanted to do was attract bugs, so I steered clear of using anything sweet. Bread would get moldy, salt was too risky. If she knocked it over, it would make a mess. Water wouldn't be special enough. Then I remembered I still had a bag of cat food in the cupboard. I poured it into a colourful kitty bowl and handed it to Rebecca. Okay, Becca, give this to your fairy friend. Be careful not to spill. Rebecca smiled. Thank you. Her little feet pitter-pattered as she ran to her room, sending pieces of cat food flying out of the bowl. Clean up on aisle everywhere. I didn't anticipate what I'd find the next morning when I went to wake up my daughter. The sight of it made my stomach twist in disgust. The bowl of cat food was empty. How was I supposed to know she'd eat it? I flip-flopped between being grossed out that my daughter had eaten the bowl of cat food and being worried about her eating something that was clearly unfit for human consumption. I shook her awake gently, trying to think of how to convey the message without scolding her. Honey, it's time to wake up. She groaned and rubbed her eyes. I helped her get dressed while still unsure of what to say. So, did you see the fairy again? Yeah, she replied. You know, honey, fairy food is very bad for humans. If she wants to share with you, you have to say no, okay? Rebecca giggled. She's too hungry to share. For some reason that made my chest tighten. Was I not feeding my daughter enough? Was her imaginary friend hungry because she was starving? Had she resorted to eating cat food out of pure desperation? Just to be on the safe side, I gave her an extra large breakfast and packed a few more snacks in our lunchbox that morning, before sending her off to school. I spent the rest of the day failing to convince myself that I wasn't a complete failure as a parent. When Rebecca came home, the extra snacks were still in her lunchbox, unopened. Honey, why didn't you eat your rice treats? I asked, a bit of parental paranoia looming over me. Wasn't hungry, she replied casually. Well, thank goodness for that. At least she knew I wasn't trying to starve her, and she had access to snacks if she needed them. With my worries alleviated, I set another bowl of cat food in her room for the night. The next morning, I found the bowl emptier than my self-esteem as a parent. I felt immensely guilty about putting it there in the first place. I should have known Rebecca had a problem. I shouldn't have exposed her to the cat food the second time. Maybe it was a side effect of losing Murphy. Maybe she wanted to feel closer to a dead pet by eating its food. Damned if I know. I wasn't going to make the same mistake a third time. No more cat food for my daughter. Now there's a sentence I never thought I'd have to say in my lifetime. It was Rebecca who woke me up the next morning. She was crying her eyes out, whining about her arm hurting. Barely conscious, I turned on the light and looked at her forearm. It looked nasty. The skin was irritated red and a small chunk near the middle was missing. She had had a few eczema flare-ups before, but never this bad. I gave her arm a delicate kiss, crawled out of bed and took her to the washroom so I could clean it up and apply a bit of soothing lotion to her skin. Oh honey, you shouldn't scratch it. It'll make it worse, I whispered. Rebecca mumbled something through her sobs, but all I understood was the word fairy. What's that, Becca? I asked. The fairy, she sniffled. She was hungry. There she was again, talking about her imaginary friend's hunger. Her hunger, I thought. The fairy food isn't safe, honey, I said. But she's hungry, she replied. There's plenty of food in the fridge. She can't open the door. She got mad. She bit me, said Rebecca, pointing to her arm. I looked at it and sighed. Honey, that's just a rash. You just scratched too hard. It was the fairy lady, she insisted. What was I supposed to do? Ruin her fantasy by telling her fairies weren't real, or try to steer her imagination back on the right track? I chose the latter. Fairies don't bite, I replied. Hungry fairies bite, she insisted. I sighed, trying my best to hide my annoyance. She was just a kid, just trying to make sense of the loss of her beloved pet. Okay, well tonight if she tries to bite you, hit her with your pillow, okay? Okay. I thought I'd done the right thing, that I'd said the right things, and that I'd heard the last of her fairy friend's escapades. I was wrong. It was the middle of the night, probably around 2 in the morning, when I heard Rebecca howling like a banshee. My instincts were to run out of bed, grab a baseball bat, and protect her from whatever had caused her to scream. By the time I reached her room and flicked the lights on, Rebecca was pushing the closet door shut, her arms tucked behind a pillow. "I got the fairy. She's in the closet." I was going to schedule an emergency counselling session for her in the morning, knowing it was all in her head, but then I heard something. A loud bang against the other side of the closet door. Goosebumps lined my arms instantly, and my grip tightened around the baseball bat. An animal must have gotten in somehow. Maybe when I opened the windows to air out the room after I painted it? Rebecca must have heard it skittering about at night and thought it was a fairy. After letting it sink in, I hurried to slide the dresser in front of the doors to keep them shut. Breathing heavily as I did, bangs continued to emerge from the other side. Rebecca was shaking, her hands holding the pillow so tightly that her knuckles had become white. In the commotion, I hadn't noticed that she was bleeding. Another little chunk of flesh was missing, this time from her left shoulder. I took her in my arms and tried to reassure her, all the while trying to reassure myself. I'd been so stupid to think that she'd imagined the fairy. I should have known better. As soon as she calmed down enough, I drove her to the emergency room to get a rabies shot. The doctors asked what had bitten her, but all I could tell them was that it was stuck in my closet, and that I'd get an exterminator to take care of it. By the time we got home, the sun was up. I had the foresight to shut her bedroom door before we left, so even if the critter got loose, it couldn't find its way into the main part of the house. Still, we avoided the corridor leading up to her room. I sat my daughter down in front of the TV and searched through the digital yellow pages for the number of an animal pest control agent. They sent someone immediately. Before long, I heard a knock at the door. "I hear you've got yourself a pest," said the animal control agent. A middle-aged man with a fair share of scratches on his skin. I nodded. "In my daughter's room. Let old Joe take care of that for you," he said, then looked at Rebecca. "It might be best not to do this in front of the kid. It gets a little messy sometimes. We try to be humane, and when they attack people, well..." He paused, considering his words carefully. "Sometimes we have to kill them," he whispered. "I'll take her to the movies. Is that okay?" "Perfect. I should be out of here in about an hour. I'll send the bill in the mail," he replied. A cheerful and colourful cinematic distraction later, we returned home. To my surprise, the pest controller's van was still parked in the driveway. Maybe the infestation was worse than I thought. I walked my daughter around back and told her to play in the yard while I spoke to the nice man. She smiled and took a seat on the swings, letting herself go like a metronome. I went inside. "Joe?" I called out. No reply. There was intangible tension in the air. The silence worried me. Nervously, I made my way to Rebecca's room. The door was half open, but something felt wrong. Every fibre of my body told me to turn tail and run, but I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Joe, the animal control officer, was resting in a puddle of blood. His throat had been torn open. The shock purely kept me from screaming, kept me from moving. I just stood there stunned as my heart raced. What kind of animal could have done this? I felt like I was going to pass out, but then I felt something soothing, a breeze, a soothing humid breeze coming from the other side of the room. I turned my head and saw the fairy door had been left wide open. Had it been open this whole time? I was drawn to it like a moth to a flame. A man was dead in my daughter's room, and I focused on that silly little door. I knelt down in front of it and peered inside. I didn't see the wall. On the other side was an unearthly landscape and looked somehow foreign and familiar. A forest of unrecognizable trees, the kind you'd find in the pages of a storybook. They were majestic, tall, full of lush foliage and bloomed flowers as large as cars. Strings of puffy dandelion-like fuzz swam through the air, breaking apart when they made contact with the branch. The sight captivated me. Then, through the heavy foliage, I heard a devious little giggle that echoed through the forest. Then another, this time from the left, and another, louder and louder, closer and closer. They were coming. I jumped back and slammed the door shut, chest thumping hard. The sound stopped, and I felt a brief moment of relief until I saw the bloody handprint on the fairy's doorknob. 4 fingers and a thumb, just like a human's, only much smaller. I looked at Joe. The door shook violently. In a daze, I pressed my ear to it. Rustling leaves, the gentle trickle of water, birds chirping, and laughter. That incessant laughter. I ripped the fairy door from the wall and threw it in my bag. Garden, I thought. I'd been told these doors had to be put in gardens, and that's where I was going to take it. Before I left, I called 911 for Joe. They determined that he'd been mauled by an animal he'd been tasked to capture and took him away while I distracted my daughter. As soon as the police were done with their report, I buckled my daughter in my car and drove to the botanical garden across town. That's where the fairy door is now, hidden behind a thorny bush. I'm praying that whatever came through the fairy door also left that way. I'm praying it's not still in the house.
Hey guys, so that draws another episode to a close. I usually don't share stories as fantastical as these ones. I try to stick to more believable ones, but I did enjoy finding them, so I thought I'd share them anyway. I did have another couple of stories, but this episode has ran a bit longer than I usually try to do. I try to keep it between like 18 and 20 minutes, around that area. But yeah, if you'd like to hear the other stories, just message me on Instagram or via email and I can get on top of that and record another episode. If you've enjoyed the episode, please leave a rating and a review on whatever platform you stream this. And if you didn't like it, just keep it to yourself. Yeah, any kind of exposure via rating, review, share, that helps so much and it'll help this podcast grow. And I cannot thank you enough. So yeah, I'll catch you guys next time. Thank you for tuning into This Strange Void, and I'll catch you guys on the other side. Bye.